So at this time, my name is Will Sparrow. I'm a former lawmaker who was very involved in the cannabis issue, especially the medical cannabis. And I will be your moderator. And we have four individuals who will be our panelists: Representative Della Albelati, Nikos Leverens, Kerry Shirota, and Mary Bailey. And at this time, I'm going to have each of them take a few minutes to introduce themselves. So why don't we just start with Mary and head to the right.
Sounds good. Aloha, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so honored to be on this panel with all of my esteemed colleagues. I am the Managing Director of Last Prisoner Project. My name is Mary Bailey. We are a national nonprofit dedicated to freeing cannabis prisoners and supporting their families along the way. I come from legacy cannabis myself, so our mission is especially important to me. We believe at Last Prisoner Project that nobody should be incarcerated for cannabis. That's why we provide pro bono legal support, commissary funds, reentry, and family support grants for cannabis prisoners and their families. To date, we've matched over 300 of our constituents, cannabis prisoners, with pro bono legal counsel. We've also provided nearly $4 million in financial grants to impacted families. Beyond direct services, we advocate for state and federal policy reform. We advocate for state and federal policy reform. We also launch nationwide awareness campaigns, and we organize large-scale lobby days in DC around 420. Here in Hawaii, my home state, our policy team has worked since 2021 to ensure retroactive relief for those harmed by cannabis prohibition. In 2022, LPP's policy recommendations were endorsed by Hawaii's Dual Use of Cannabis Task Force, and we were named in a state resolution urging clemency for cannabis convictions. At the close of last year's legislative session, an LPP-led bill was signed into law as Act 62, which created Hawaii's first ever automatic record-clearing law for cannabis offenses. As of December 2024, over 2,100 individuals have been identified as eligible for expungement. We also helped pass legislation establishing a statewide task force to expand automatic record clearance over time. Our policy director, Adrian Roca, continues to provide technical expertise to support this effort. As a 20-year resident of Maui, I'm grateful to see LPP's work making a real impact here in Hawaii, and thank you so much for having me.
Aloha. Thank you, Will, for having me be on this panel with these wonderful people working so hard in the community. My name is Della Albelati. I'm the state representative for District 26, which represents the communities of Pakiki, Tapmas, Papakolea, and Punchbowl. I have been in the legislature for the last 18 years, heading into my 19th and 20th year. So excited to be here. I have family members who are medical cannabis patients. I was instrumental in helping pass the medical cannabis dispensary law, and I am just excited that we are hopefully at a new cusp of more legislation that will regulate the industry for both public safety and to achieve social equity goals. So thanks again, Will, for having me here.
Aloha, my name is Nikos Leverens. I'm with Drug Policy Forum of Hawaii, which is now a project of Hawaii Health and Harm Reduction Center. The mission of Hawaii Health and Harm Reduction Center is to reduce harm, promote wellness, fight stigma across Hawaii and the Pacific. I was born and raised in Honolulu, Hawaii, graduated from Marino a year before this person next to me. So it's wonderful to be here to talk about cannabis. I've been working in the cannabis space on and off for, I think this is officially my 21st year now, actually. Back when I was working with Drug Policy Alliance's California Capital Office in the mid-aughts, even medical cannabis was very, very controversial. So I've been through the ringer a bit. I think Hawaii has a really unique opportunity here, and we've had it for a bit. Now that other states have legalized, we've seen what works, what doesn't work. And I think that we have a bill here that represents a good balance between broader-based participation and reasonable, rational regulation and taxation that can promote social equity within the sector and also reduce the negative impacts of cannabis prohibition in our communities, particularly in our Native Hawaiian and Filipino communities. Mahalo.
Aloha kako. My name is Carrie Ann Shirota. I'm the Policy Director for the ACLU of Hawaii. I was born and raised in the country of the island of Maui, and I still consider Maui home, even though I'm living in the city currently. In terms of ACLU of Hawaii, we are an affiliate of the National ACLU. Our mission is to protect, advance all of our collective civil rights and liberties. And sometimes lawmakers have asked me, why is the ACLU interested in cannabis legalization? For me, it seems really apparent, but it's not always clear. And so I just want to say for the record that ACLU of Hawaii supports cannabis legalization for a few reasons. First, because this is a civil liberty issue. Just as individuals should be able to have the right to choose whether they have an abortion, reproductive autonomy, whether they choose to have children or not, to access the abortion pill, they should be able to choose to have a cocktail or cannabis. It's very clear to us that that is a personal liberty interest. Second reason why we're also pushing for this particular bill and advocating for it is that we recognize there are privacy interests at stake. Unlike other states, we have a provision in our Hawaii Constitution that explicitly protects the right to privacy. What people are doing within their home, why is there government intrusion and interference in that? The third reason is that we know that prohibition and the war on drugs has disparately impacted Black communities, Latino, people of color, indigenous communities, and here in Hawaii, Native Hawaiians. Not only adults, but also youth. And I'm sure that Nikos will share some of the statistics to show that there are still youth and adults being arrested for cannabis, despite some of the rhetoric that people are not being arrested for it. And so the fourth reason that we're interested is that we understand that the war on drugs has real consequences that have been harmful to people. Once someone has a record, whether it's arrests or convictions, that stays with them. It can be a barrier for jobs, housing, other life opportunities. So we are very invested in a bill that ensures that there is social equity to address harms and that we have a process of expungement of these records so that people can move forward. And probably later on we can share a little bit about a personal reason why I also support cannabis legalization. Mahalo.
Thank you, panelists. So our first question, relatively simple and easy, and feel free to answer as personal opinion or your organization. And what would you say when you're looking at cannabis compared to alcohol and cigarettes? Is cannabis safer, worse, similar to, or no opinion? Nikos?
Aloha, thank you for asking that question. This really strikes at the heart of how I first came to be involved in this. When I was in junior high, I read a magazine called Liberty, and there was an outfit called Drug Sense, and it took a look, did a comparative look at alcohol, heroin, tobacco, and cannabis, both in terms of addiction potential, in terms of physiological effects, and in terms of withdrawal symptoms, and in terms of, just negative consequences from the law. And all in all, the science side, compared to tobacco and alcohol, tobacco still kills about 400,000 people a year in this country. Alcohol kills about, give or take, 35 to 50,000 people a year. There are negative consequences to cannabis, but they are exceedingly rare. There are some people who deal with hyperemesis syndrome. That often comes with consuming too much over a protracted period of time. But in terms of just your ordinary user, your casual user, habitual use, everyday use, weekly use, weekender use, generally speaking, cannabis does not give you even the type of hangover it does, that alcohol does. And it certainly doesn't, it's proven not to have the negative social consequences, immediate social consequences, in terms of violence, intimate partner violence, familial violence, violence that one can see probably at bars and some of the bars that I used to frequent when I was a fraternity member in Los Angeles and thereabouts. Alcohol does a lot of damage in this country and everywhere. And to the extent that people can move from alcohol toward cannabis, as has been the case in Canada and even some jurisdictions over time, over years, there has been a decrease in alcohol consumption. So it's a benefit for an individual who's looking for, a mild intoxicant, relatively mild intoxicant that is more sedative than upregulated, and it can be used in a responsible fashion. Cannabis use disorder, there will be people who will become, who will overuse and who it might be problematic for them. And that's true for a lot of substances, but I think if you look at the scope of people entering counseling and substance use, you'll find that very few, if any, people are there solely for cannabis use disorder. So when we talk about the relative risks of substances, cannabis is much lower than alcohol, and it doesn't have the addiction potential and certainly the negative health impacts that tobacco continues to have.
Representative?
For all of the reasons that Nico said, for adults, I believe cannabis is safer than tobacco and alcohol. I do not advocate the use of cannabis for youth. I think on developing brains, we need to be concerned about the effects of cannabis, and so I would say I'm going to leave it to the experts for youth use. Thank you.
Mary?
I think alcohol is by far more dangerous than cannabis. It's not even a question for me. That's a really an absolute no-brainer.
Okay. Carrie, you want to chime in?
For all the policy wonks that like data, I just want to cite CDC, Center for Disease Control, says that about 170,000 people die from excessive alcohol use in the US. It's responsible for that many deaths, 480 deaths per day, and it says this includes alcoholic liver disease, cirrhosis, psychosis, dependence syndrome, alcohol poisoning, and homicide, almost close to 8,000 related homicides connecting with alcohol. The CDC has no such tally for cannabis, none.
Okay, so alcohol is legal. Cigarettes are legal. Representative, should we legalize cannabis?
Yes, for dual use,
Dual use meaning,
medicinal use and adult use.
and what degree of oversight? I mean, without getting into too much details, because I know, you've got the state government, the county government, and then the feds.
Sure. For your audience who's watching, I
Yes.
think looking at House Bill 1246 that's moving currently through the 2025, sorry, we're in 2025, this current legislative session, I think that there's a really good framework there. We need a system that continues to allow for the medical use of cannabis, but we also have to translate those kinds of public safety practices that we have around laboratory and testing, and then licensing and safe distribution and regulations around commercial packaging and all of that to the market. I hope that we see for adult use cannabis.
Great. And Carrie, you said you had a story you would like to share? On the legalization aspect?
Sure. It's always been very curious to me why we prohibit and criminalize a particular plant, right? One plant versus another plant. We know that plants throughout time immemorial have medicinal properties, but what is it about this one plant, right, that we're so worried about? I grew up, again, very rural area in the island of Maui, and before I was born, just shortly before I was born, my mom's younger brother was 17, and he was diagnosed with leukemia. And this was at a time, maybe there were less options for patients with cancer. And within 4 months of his actual diagnosis and to his death, my mom said that he severely suffered from pain, tremendous nausea. And my mom said that despite the hurt and the pain of seeing him go through this, There was a nurse who was an angel because cannabis was illegal at the time, but she somehow obtained cannabis for him. And that helped, that was the one thing that to help to alleviate his pain and suffering until he died 4 months after diagnosis at age 17. And so we know that there are recognized medicinal properties to cannabis. Why are we criminalizing it? Why?
Okay. Well, let's say, since we have a very pro.
If I could quickly
Yes.
just respond to what you said. You know, cannabis has been part of the human apothecary for 10,000 years. And when we look at the relatively recent criminalization of cannabis, namely its inclusion on Schedule 1 in the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, we have Nixon on tape saying that we need to deal with this cannabis problem because, you know, there are Jewish lawyers who are advocating against for it. There are Jewish psychiatrists like Lester Grinspoon, who wrote a wonderful book called Marijuana, the Forbidden Medicine, or I forget what it was called back then. The title, Marijuana Reconsidered, was the ultimate title. And African Americans and anti-war protesters. So there's an inherent inequity baked into the inclusion of cannabis in the Controlled Substances Act, period, but especially on cannabis on Schedule 1. So to the extent that we can, you know, look to taking it out, we would be repairing the harm, you know, inflicted upon Black and brown communities over a half a century. So it's past time to reform this. And I'm hopeful that, you know, Hawaii can join those states that have legalized adult use, maintain its medical cannabis program, maintain a friendly climate for cannabis-related research. Hopefully we can get to the point where we actually have, you know, labs here conducting medical research as is being done, for example, in Israel. California has a medical cannabis research institute. We need to find out more about the wonderful properties of cannabis and, you know, and see what the potentialities are. It's already been there, but we can explore it a bit more. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Mary, should cannabis be taxed? And so, how much? And/or, you know, we have the difference between the adult use and medicinal use. What are your thoughts on taxing cannabis?
Honestly, I don't think I'm the right person to answer this question. I think it should be passed.
Okay. Representative.
I'll take that on. Yes, I do believe cannabis should be taxed. I think as we look at it moving forward through the legislative process, we have recommendations that part of those taxes should be committed to things like public education campaigns, awareness campaigns. Some of it should be put towards funding the government agencies that are going to need to enforce it. You know, fund the registry, continue to fund the registry systems for medical cannabis. So I think it's a important piece of the legislation that has to continue to move forward. I think we can debate about the amounts that can be taxed. I know in other jurisdictions they have different levels of taxation. I prefer a one single tax, and then the monies are shared amongst the counties and the state. I do not think it should be overtaxed. I also don't think that medical cannabis should be taxed at the same rate. In fact, if there's a potential to be able to protect the medical cannabis market a little bit more to ensure that there is continued access to medical cannabis if we move towards a dual system, I think we should see a reduction in medical cannabis because it is medicine and it shouldn't be subject to the same kind of taxations that other kinds of products are. So I think, again, it's a piece that's important and it's something that I would support, and it will help us, I think, move the needle on some of these other concerns that folks have around the legalization of cannabis.
Nikos?
Taxation can also help with, you know, potential business and job creation here in this state, and give us a framework where we can actually support our small businesses and even some of our larger businesses, and create a climate where people who want to, you know, invest and engage in our emerging cannabis industry should be happy to do so. Cannabis taxation can also fund after-school programs, which is the best anti-drug program out there. After-school programs also are great violence prevention programs as well. So we shouldn't tax it too high, obviously, but we certainly want to bring it to a situation where we have regulatory stability, assurance that all actors in this state are on board with creating a workable market for the betterment of our communities. Mahalo.
Can I add to that? So, because you reminded me about this, in the bill, there is actually a social equity grant program. And I think it's really important to understand and recognize that we know that there are folks that are shut out of the industry.
Well, we could address that. Yeah, I've got some questions specifically on social equity.
Okay,
Yes.
I will wait on that.
Great, great. Did you want to say something, Carrie? Or you good?
I think when we get to social equity a little more.
Okay. Now, one of the biggest issues and concerns on the discussion of legalizing cannabis is the impact of cannabis on our youth. And I like to think that all of us here agree that we don't want our youth using cannabis unless they need it for medicinal purposes. So, with that notion, are there studies out there from the other states that have legalized that address the impact of cannabis on our teens, on their teens? What's the best practices? And you mentioned already some items to keep our youth from using cannabis. And if our youth do become users or addicted, are there enough treatment beds in Hawaii to deal with this issue? Nikos? Drug Policy Forum.
Let me just also be clear that Drug Policy Forum, its legacy in this issue, we helped pass the original medical cannabis law in the year 2000. We also helped pass the dispensary law in 2015. This happened when I was away from the continent, away on the continent, and I'm happy to carry that forward. In terms of youth use rates, even in states that have legalized adult use, the Youth Risk Behavioral Survey from Monitoring the Future, University of Michigan, has shown a steep decrease in cannabis youth rates over time since legalization, especially in the past 5 to 7 years. Drug Policy Forum of Hawaii also believes that people who have substance use disorder, including cannabis use disorder, should be able to access treatment outside of the criminal legal context. But we have a lack of providers on that front. In terms of what they're going to treatment for, I think you'd be hard pressed to find that treatment slots are good for cannabis use disorder. I'm not sure that treatment, that residential treatment is appropriate or needed for cannabis use alone. Most people entering residential treatment and even intensive outpatient treatment have multiple substances involved, and that often includes alcohol and the so-called harder drugs. So I don't want to engage in drug exceptionalism. I think that behavioral health problems and substance use needs to be treated holistically. However, what we do see in the current status quo, even in a decriminalized state, is the continued criminalization of users through arrests. I ran the data from the Uniform Crime Reports. Because cannabis is still Schedule I, we get to see the number of arrests that happen in Hawaii in a given year. And even after 2019, when we decriminalize 3 grams or less, we still see hundreds of arrests in this state, in every county, and dozens of youth are brought into the criminal legal system. It does not help children to criminalize them. It does not help their families to criminalize them. It does not help their community to criminalize them. Criminalization is the most severe and lasting stigma that can be inflicted on a person for their lifetime. Granted, youth will have their records cleared, but once you have that entree into the criminal legal system, you've set a variety of processes in motion where that youth has been stigmatized, marginalized, and subject to negative influences. And that's going to have an adverse effect on their health and well-being in that moment and on their long-term health and well-being.
I just add that Nikos talked about those overall statistics, and when we looked at it, it was very clear that there were racial disparities for the youth. Native Hawaiians and Filipino youth in Hawaii were the most likely to be arrested for cannabis use. And I just want to address the issue about access to substance abuse treatment, if that is needed, because many times it is not appropriate, but people may over-diagnose and say, we're just going to send you to treatment without actually having professionals making that determination. But we know throughout Hawaii, and especially on the neighbor islands, if someone needs residential or outpatient treatment, there's often a wait. First of all, you might need an assessment, but if you don't have the money or you don't have insurance to get an assessment, there's a wait. What if they do the assessment and if they in fact recommend treatment, there may be a wait list. So there's often wait lists to get the help that youth or adult may need, but we have no wait lists to get into our overcrowded jails and prisons. And until we address the underlying roots of that system, we will continue to see these disparities and harmful effects in our community.
Thank you. Okay, let's move over to DUIs. And I want to briefly talk a little about DUIs because obviously what happens with DUIs and those utilizing alcohol can also transfer over to cannabis users. So first of all, has any state or anybody yet made an invention to test THC? I know there's been talk about it, like the blow for alcohol, but I don't think so. Is that a correct statement? Anyone on the panel?
I believe that's a correct statement.
Okay.
And I think really the best standard for kind of public safety is that we really need to have drug recognition experts, employed by our law enforcement. And so that's a better way that doesn't distinguish between, different types of drugs, whether it's cannabis or alcohol. We need to have law enforcement officers who are trained to recognize bad behavior and stop that bad behavior if they notice it on the roads.
So you talk about whether they're swerving or when they're stopped slurring or red eyes or whatever the case may be.
Exactly, and then the drug recognition experts have to go through a checklist of numerous things to determine if someone is really dangerous on the roads, and that's for me, and maybe we could Carrie can speak to it more. I think that's a better and more effective way to address whether or not someone is actually dangerous on the streets, and make sure that if appropriate, that they are taken off the streets to protect people.
I just want to add to that because most people assume when you hear DUI that it means alcohol impairment. But if you look at the statute, it can be any type of substance that someone could be charged with driving under the impairment. And I say that as formerly being a public defender. And so that standard, and if I've heard even some prosecutors in other states, even the Kauai prosecutor said that standard should be utilized for any possible substance and impairment rather than distinguishing between the two.
Very good. Now, regarding DUI and alcohol, and I don't know if you have an opinion on this, Mary, but there's been talk of lowering the threshold from 0.08 to 0.05. Is that a good idea, Mary? Or what are your thoughts?
I mean, personally, no, I don't think it's necessary, and especially if we don't have an easy way to test it immediately. Also, I personally do not think that it's necessary.
Anyone else want to address that? And I think most of us might agree on that.
Yeah, I'm kind of an agnostic on that question as to 0.08 versus 0.05, but I do think that if a person is arrested, they need to blow something. And we know that it's the case in this county that people who've blown 0.0 have been arrested, and I think the ACLU has taken a lawsuit to that effect. I will say that I think alcohol needs to be more heavily taxed, whether it's beer and wine or hard liquor, given the significant medical, social, and health externalities that come from alcohol use. I don't think that people who consume alcohol and people who sell alcohol are paying, what they need to pay for given the impact, the negative impact that alcohol has on a person's health and on our medical systems. I know I'm next to a politician, so hopefully she'll be listening to that. But when you ask for higher taxes, even in this deep blue state, it's often a tall order.
Okay. Cannabis in public places. Should adult use be passed? Should people be allowed to smoke in public places, sidewalks, parks, beaches? Mary?
I personally think that you should be able to smoke cannabis anywhere that you're allowed to smoke a cigarette.
Okay.
It just makes sense. If you can drink alcohol somewhere, you should also be able to smoke cannabis. For the most part, it's basic, in my opinion.
I think with that said, I think here in the state of Hawaii, we have very strong clean air laws. And that is our history with tobacco. And so I support smoking of cannabis in those same places where it's also allowed by law. But I think here's a short story. I was in New York City with my daughters this past spring, and it was a little shocking to me to see the extent to which there was public smoking in a lot of places as I was just walking down the street with my daughters. And I thought, wow, I did not appreciate that. And we were standing in line at at one of these big Broadway shows, and then someone just came walking by and had huge signs and was saying, "Want your cannabis? Want your cannabis?" And I was like, I thought that was not legal in the state of New York. And so I think that kind of blatant use of it, I think that's what's shocking to some people. And so I would support, again, allowing cannabis where it is according to our laws. And I think the next question you might ask is, I do think that we should allow places for cannabis-like lounges, use in private places where there is agreement, where there's some kind of understanding that it's for a business and that it's contained and it's certainly not with youth involved. I think that's a really important line for me to draw.
Yes, I very much agree with everything that Representative Bellotti has said. I really think that we need to be very careful about carving out exemptions to our indoor air quality laws. I think we also need to be mindful of the neighborhood effects that Representative Bellotti encountered in New York City. But at the same time, there needs to be safer consumption spaces. I went to Lemoore, California a few years ago, and Lemoore is a really small town in the Central Valley in Tulare County. And they had a cannabis lounge that was quite amazing. I was just passing through, so I just wanted to check it out. And I have a picture of it somewhere in my roll, but that was a great place. And we also need to make provisions for lanais and rooftops, places of business. We have remarkable sunsets and remarkable skies here. How awful it would be to prohibit people from smoking or consuming cannabis and not avail themselves of the natural beauty that comes with just witnessing a sunset, for example. So, we need to regulate it, but as a general matter, we need to facilitate some smoking. But there are alternatives as well, right? There are edibles that are available, and for many people, that is their preferred method of delivery as well.
Would you panelists support adult use and homegrown cannabis?
Absolutely. Yes, and we have to, and we need to support our people. Should be able to grow it at home. It's imperative. They should not have to go to dispensary. It's great that there are dispensaries available for people, but they should absolutely be able to. It's a must, and some people cannot afford to go to a dispensary, so they have to grow it at home, and they could also be multi-generational. Yes, we absolutely must protect our homegrown.
And should there be limits on those? How many plants? Anybody?
I agree that it should be homegrown, and this is where we might disagree, but
Most likely.
yeah. I think certainly for medical patients, there should be homegrown. Also for adult use, I agree. I do think that the number of plants should be limited, and I think currently under medical, it's 10 plants for each patient. And I think a number of that range or below for adult use. I also think another way to kind of help with the regulation and possession is that both medical and adult should be able to have certain amounts of flower with them, you know, that might not reflect what the plants are. So I think there's a number of ways that we can regulate it so that people have access and, you know, and are not criminalized.
I think one of the chief benefits of most of the adult use bills that have come down over the transom, including this year's HB 1246 and SB 1613, is that it does have a provision for home grow, and that if people have the means to grow their own cannabis, then they should be able to do that. And that's not the case in other jurisdictions on the continent. In terms of, you know, the collective association, on the medical context, I strongly believe that the right to collectively associate must be honored, but at the same time, there should be some level of limitations on that. You know, we can talk number of plants, number of cards, so-called cards that are allowed to be stacked. Clearly, it should be just more than just one or two, but you know, anything above, you know, a dozen would be, you know, need to be regulated if we're going to do that on its own track.
I'm going to point out, we have some excerpts about the actual bill. This is HB 1246, which is going to be scheduled for a hearing next week, Tuesday. The total amount of cannabis at any one home cannot exceed 10 plants and 2 pounds, regardless of the number of adults and patients living there. So that's what's currently in the bill. So if any of you disagree, you want that to be increased, otherwise, that would be your opportunity to weigh in. But that's currently the draft. And as we know, the legislative process, there can be amendments, there can be changes, but please weigh in next week, Tuesday.
If the state does not go towards legalization of adult use, should cannabis be decriminalized more? When I was in office, we did decriminalize. I think now it's a fine or X amount, but should it be decriminalized more?
Short answer is yes, and that any amount up to 1 ounce, in my view, and we did have a bill last year that would have effectuated that. It got whittled down and it got killed in the House. Ultimately, I believe Senator San Buenaventura has a measure now, I don't have the bill in front of me, to decriminalize 15 grams, so just over half of an ounce. And I think any increase in decriminalization across the board is a welcome measure.
Okay.
I think it's also important to point out, though, too, if it is decriminalized, it also should be retroactive for people who have been negatively impacted by the criminalization previously. I think that's just like very, very important. You're saying that it's, you know, no longer bad, then the people that have been negatively affected before should definitely have an opportunity to enter the legal industry. That's super important, and just lower their barriers to entry as well.
Can I just add to that? I think, and then I want to also look to Carrie because I think ACLU has been helpful in this. I think the efforts for expungement have moved forward, and I know
That's
also,
my next question,
I know.
by the way, record expungement. So why don't you go right? Go ahead.
And I know that Mary has also, her organization has helped us really write some good laws. I think we need to really give a shout out to AG and Lopez, whose office is working very hard to make sure that we follow through on the laws that we passed last year. And in fact, there are a number of expungement measures moving forward in this legislative session. So if you are interested, I would encourage you to follow through on that. I mean, I think, as Carrie said, these kinds of records can stay with people for a very long time. And so it's really, I think, when they did their very first big expungement clinic in Waimanalo, they had some really good results. And I think that's the kind of focus that I would like to follow up on.
So who should have record expungement? Should it be everyone with a crime related to cannabis, or are there some crimes related to cannabis that should not have record expungement? Carrie?
Well, ACLU's position is that we definitely believe that cannabis possession charges should be expunged, and that there are governors who have the clemency power to be able to do that with basically a swoop of a pen, and to use that for redemption, second chances. So absolutely, but we go beyond that. ACLU Hawaii supports Clean Slate, and Clean Slate is a nationwide movement that you're not only looking at drug charges, but that over a period of time, if someone does not have any new arrests or particularly convictions, for a number of charges that they have, that we, quote, wipe the slate clean. And that makes sense because of the barriers that people face, even if they have a record from like 10, 20 years ago, have changed their life, who've gone to treatment, so we see it as a work development opportunity, people improving their life, having access to other opportunities, not just for themselves, because when we create these barriers through records, we're actually not only punishing that person, we're punishing their family. We're punishing communities who are often under-resourced, over-policed. That has been the case and that continues to be the case. And so we need to look at it systemically. And there are tools. Again, the governor has the ability to use clemency powers to essentially pardon people, maybe even commute sentences. If someone is currently in a jail or prison for a cannabis charge, the governor could use his clemency powers for that. But the Clean Slate, I just want to go on this a little bit more, is that there is currently a Clean Slate task force. A number of us are on that. I'm on that Clean Slate. We're looking at as broad as possible records. And I just want to encourage those of you who support Clean Slate, there will be opportunities for the community to weigh in, because we want it to be as broad as possible so many people can benefit from Clean Slate.
I'd like to add to that too, if possible.
If I make this one, so when you say clean slate, basically it never happened. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's a little,
There's
sort of like, there's some technical aspects.
Yes.
So right now, currently, if you have an arrest record, the repository of that information is through the Hawaii Criminal Justice Status Center, which falls under the Attorney General. So the work that marijuana, LPP, a number of our organizations have been supporting for expunging arrest non-conviction records is through this repository through the Attorney General's office. And I do want to just point out some statistics from the AGs. This was a year ago that they ran their database, and there were over 50,000 arrests in Hawaii for cannabis-related charges, 50,000, and over 10,000 convictions for a period of years. So we're looking at how many people in our community are impacted by that. Now, if someone has a conviction, that is a slightly more complicated process. There are only some offenses, criminal offenses, that are considered eligible for expungement. But if you have that process, then that goes through the courts, and then the courts have their own records, and those records are sealed. Now, there's still some exemptions even under Clean Slate, but I think that's getting into the weeds a little bit, but there is a process for that, and Clean Slate means we use technology to run through the database, and then after a period of time, if that person doesn't have new convictions, we use the technology to wipe it away. Now, it can still be saved, but like a landlord or somebody else who's doing a background check, that don't pull up. And this has happened in a number of cases, and I want to illustrate how it plays itself out, whether drugs. There was a woman on Maui for some years ago. I actually was a program director of a reintegration program on Maui, and there was a woman in our program. She was just moved on in her life. She had been earning her, working towards social work. And I think she also earned her substance abuse treatment. But she kept facing barriers, and at one point in time, she felt so fortunate that she was pulled up for housing, a subsidy. But when they ran the background check, there were charges. And so the first, she got a letter to say you're not eligible. But thankfully we had some friends and myself, and we advocated and helped her to appeal, and it was granted. So she finally got that housing, which was not only for her, but for her children. So these are the implications and consequences of what expungement does to families and especially children.
Mary?
Yeah, I'd like to add too is when we're talking about even beyond who should be eligible, I think it's the process of how people can get their records expunged, because we know for a fact that less than 6.5% of individuals who are eligible for expungement actually end up getting expunged because they have to do the whole petitioning process is so intense. These are impacted people who have already had to deal with the justice system. They most likely are low income, and it's just overwhelming. So one thing our organization really advocates for is a state-initiated process that is basically, it's called automatic expungements. It means that people don't have to petition to get their records expunged. The state is in charge of it, and it just is automatically rolled out. And we feel that that is particularly important to make the biggest impact for people who have been criminalized for cannabis.
And I just want to add to that, not only is the process really difficult to navigate, even attorneys who are volunteer attorneys helping with this in expungement clinic were saying this is really confusing. So imagine what a layperson is going through, but in addition to this paper process, you're required to spend $50 plus for even one type of charge. So you can see this starts racking up, it's expensive. So the idea behind Clean Slate and automated or state-initiated expungement is that the state initiates it and they won't charge you for it. And to just kind of bring back, actually the first expungement clinic, I want to give credit to where it's due. Last Prisoner Project did collaborate with ACLU, I think in like maybe 2018, 2019. At the law school just before COVID. And then recently we partnered with a number of organizations, including the judiciary, a number of stakeholders. We had one at the YNI Public Library last year, and in 4 hours we helped nearly 100 people to be either clearing expungement, non-conviction arrests, or bench warrant recall. And just recently, last month, we also held a clinic. Actually, it was earlier this month. The time is whizzing by. We were at Waimanalo at the elementary school, and I think we served about 70 people for either bench warrant recall or for expungement.
Is it easier to get a pardon than an expungement?
Generally, yes, it would be easier to get an expungement, but it also depends upon what the offense is. Like if it's an arrest, typically if you have an arrest across the board, people should be able to clear their arrest if it does not lead to conviction. And it makes sense because an arrest is an accusation which has not been proven in court at all. So you should be able to have that removed from your record. So that process should be automated. Why should we put the burden on an individual where there's an allegation of a criminal offense but has never been proven in a court of law? So that's the first part of it. But pardons inherently are very political. I mean, I think you've heard about the president pardoning a number of people who, so I mean, I probably should stop about that. But it is an inherently political process. And here in Hawaii, if a person wants a pardon, they fill out a form, which goes through the Hawaii Paroling Authority, which is a sort of arm of the Department of Public Safety, now Corrections. And then it goes to the governor's office. There's sort of a vetting process. But if you look at it, it's very statistically small, the number of people who are ever pardoned, despite all the things that they've done in their life to change. And so we are pushing and have been pushing. And I want to highlight the governor of Oregon, the last governor, I'm sorry, her name is escaping me, but I think she had a record number of pardons, more than anyone else. And recently, Governor Moore in another state, he, with a stroke of a pen, I think, how many?
Maryland. It was 175,000.
175,000 using the power of clemency and a stroke of a pen. And so I want to encourage all of you. We have had conversations and meeting with some of the governor's policy advisors, and we would love to see Governor Green to use that clemency power for this justice.
If I could just briefly interject here also, within the first year of legalizing adult use, the state of Missouri clear the records of over 100,000 people automatically, on an automatic basis. So let's look at that as well.
I'd like to shift to racial disparities with law enforcement when it comes to cannabis. That might be a bigger issue on the mainland versus here, although there are issues here with Native Hawaiians, with Filipinos. Any comments regarding racial disparities? And Mary?
Yeah, I mean, I could just start by saying we know for a fact that people of color are 5 times as likely to be arrested for cannabis. That's a really strong number. I think it's very telling. Does legalizing adult use cannabis get rid of racial disparities? No, but it does decrease the amount law enforcement interacts with people of color or communities of color. So hopefully that does help things move along in a more positive direction.
I think it's really fitting. Today's February 1st, which is Black History Month, right? That we're talking about racial disparities. Some years ago, ACLU National put out a report that looked at these stark disparities. And I just want to quote, there's every 0.01 hours, someone in the United States is arrested for having marijuana. I know we call here cannabis here, but a Black person is nearly 4 times more likely to be arrested than a white person on the continent. And here in Hawaii, I think the data there's dips in, but we know within the youth, in that uniform data report that Nico cited, it was clear that Native Hawaiian and Filipino youth were most likely. And if it makes sense, certain communities are more likely to be policed and under surveillance, which means that there's more likely to be an interaction with the police, which then could maybe lead to a search, whether it's legal or illegal. And so, again, I think part of it is, even though if you decriminalize or even legalize, it does not magically remove all racial disparities. Unfortunately, racism is baked into, for many of us believe, into the fabric of the criminal legal system, into certain communities, but it can reduce the harm. And so from a harm reduction perspective, if we can reduce the number of people who are affected by this war on drugs and cannabis, then we should absolutely do it. Because some people said, well, it's unintended consequence. Whether it's unintended or not, whether you say it's unconscious bias or not, you need to look at the outcomes. And the outcomes are clear and stark, and we can do better.
In the states where they have legalized adult use, has crime increased? And any tie or connection with the cannabis? Nikos?
Before we get to that issue, I just wanted to get to the racial disparities in law enforcement, and that Hawaii is not immune to this. First, I want to congratulate Representative Bellotti for issuing a wonderful resolution in 2020 during the pandemic that declared racism as a public health crisis in our state. And in the operation of our criminal legal system, with respect to drug law enforcement specifically, and the Native Hawaiian community, it's very clear that at every stage of the process, Native Hawaiians are disproportionately impacted, from the surveillance, to the arrest, to the charging, to the prosecution, to the sentencing, to the incarceration, to subjugation to criminal legal supervision, to we have a probation system here that has the highest average term in the nation at 59 months, almost 5 years. Granted, it's often done in lieu of a prison sentence. We also have a very draconian drug possession law, non-cannabis, of course. Well, not of course, but the underlying possession law states that any amount, including unusable traces and residue, of a non-cannabis, Schedule I drug, results in a possible 5-year prison term and $10,000 fine. So we need to take a look at that as well. In terms of whether adult use cannabis has facilitated crime, increased crime, maybe at the outset there are hot spots and we've seen flare-ups, but in the general sense, no, that is not the case. Even in terms of traffic fatalities, the 4 states, California, Maine, and 2 others actually saw a decrease in traffic fatalities. So of course it's crime reduction when you stop criminalization. That's axiomatic.
Carrie?
Sorry, I just need to weigh in here. Nico's just mentioned about the fact that there have been reports, literally studies for decades, unfortunately. It's very tragic. We see a continuum of Native Hawaiians at every entry point into the criminal legal system, from arrest to then conviction to longer sentences. Then if they're under parole or probation supervision, they're more likely to be revoked, and that can lead to incarceration. One thing that the bill legalization will do that we do not currently have, if someone is under probation or parole supervision, if they are using cannabis and let's say they get tested for drugs, that can often be the basis for them to be revoked from parole or probation and then potentially to do longer sentences and or more incarceration. And so that's something we obviously support. And we know that even interestingly enough, the Kauai prosecutor, Becky Like, she does not believe that she supports this idea that if we are to move towards legalization, that it cannot be used as the basis to revoke people from probation, because she sees the impact and she supports treatment if it is necessary.
Thank you. We have a new administration in Washington, D.C. President Biden was looking at rescheduling. It's been put on hold, although we're hoping that the current president will continue, if not go further. Will the Trump administration be helpful in the adult use legalization sphere? Anybody?
It's hard for me to comment on that just because during this week there's been so much erratic behavior coming out of that Trump administration. But I will say, I think if there's any kind of bipartisan work done, I think at the federal level what would be most helpful is if they can clarify the banking regulations. And I think that's really important. I know that there are folks that want to see rescheduling. I think for me, the difficulty with rescheduling, though, is that it throws a lot of states into chaos because of the patchwork of regulations we have in different states. So, in an informational briefing that we had before the Judiciary Committee just this past week, there's some conversation about, well, if there is movement at the federal level, states that have varying programs will be able to have kind of different leverage points, and they'll be able to come to the table to help advocate for measures that will harmonize with the current programs. And I think that's a really important thing to watch, because as we advocate for a federal action, I want to make sure that our state system and our state medical patients are also not harmed from any kind of movement that we might get from any of the regulatory agencies that have oversight over cannabis.
I actually had hopes, and they were dashed hopes, that given Joe Biden's long history as a drug war extremist over the course of his political career, that when he became president, he would actually change course, and he did to a certain extent. But on the cannabis front, he really just kind of tinkered around the edges. And did so at the last possible moment. It was good to see that there was a ticket, on the Democratic side of the aisle that was for legalization fully. That's the first time that's happened in modern American history. In terms of what we can expect from this administration, I don't even know if people in the administration know what to expect from the administration. However, we do know that Trump was supportive of the cannabis measure that failed by a few points. There needs to be a 60% threshold in Florida for ballot measures to pass there. It got 57, I believe. And he also, selected initially, Matt Gaetz as his attorney general, who was very good on cannabis. However, I would also point out to people that one of his main political benefactors is Miriam Adelson, and the Adelsons have been very staunch cannabis opponents, and I don't think the influence of Miriam Adelson can be discounted if she chooses to go that route. So I think when we look to the federal government, banking is important. Safe banking has become a holiday ritual in the Beltway. I actually kind of, joke with cannabis, some cannabis journalists that, it's a gift that keeps on giving. Is safe banking going to happen this year in the budget reconciliation at the end of the year? And yeah, it hasn't happened yet. But our focus must be, as advocates, as community, as people who consume or are in the space, take it out, deschedule as soon as possible.
Mary?
I'll briefly say too, I was also incredibly disappointed that more cannabis prisoners were not released during the Biden administration. We're really hopeful. We're working very close with the administration on it. It was wonderful that he released 2,500 people several weeks ago. Unfortunately, out of those 2,500 people, we're only sure that, and there may be more, but it's going to take a lot of time to go through each one of those cases. Our organization is only aware of 10 of them being cannabis people out of 2,500, which was absolutely heartbreaking. I communicate with a lot of prisoners, some of them serving life sentences, and to be the one to tell them that they were not on that list, I had a lot of tears for several days doing that, being completely honest. It was really heartbreaking. But I am very happy for those 2,500 families. They absolutely deserved it. I was just also hoping for more cannabis as well, because it is a plant medicine and it has never killed anybody. So noting that. But I will say that Trump actually had a really positive history in his first administration when it comes to criminal justice and drug reform, specifically by signing the First Step Act, which retroactively helped with the crack cocaine disparity, as well as the Support Act, which increased the treatment capacity of Medicaid providers to deliver substance abuse disorder treatment. So we are hoping that we can have some positive steps forward.
Mary, do you know what number of those people that were impacted by the president's decision were from Hawaii? Is there a number there?
No, we don't. And actually, we've been trying to find out for years. I know with the ACLU and so many other orgs, years, how many people are in prison for cannabis from Hawaii, and have not had luck. And I would love for if Nikos or Carrie Ann has any statements as well about that particular subject.
Accessing data here. Obviously, our jails and prisons are closed systems, institutions, and so it's very difficult to actually obtain data. It's sort of piecemeal here and there. We keep pushing, but it's not very clear how many people are in. And even when this pilot project was enacted, passed this law for limiting, starting on Hawaii Island, for expungement of non-conviction arrest records, there was this sort of confusion. Well, because how do you prove if someone had was it for cannabis possession or some other drugs? And so the agency, the AG said first says, well, we can't do it because the record, literally the court record, is not very clear showing the evidence. And I'm like, well, why was someone even arrested if you don't even have proof of it? So there is a technical fix to that bill that's being introduced this session that we're supporting. I know that LPP and other organizations, but it's not always clear. But I think a shout out to LPP. If you know anyone in Hawaii or sent out of state to private prison in Saguaro or through the federal system, and they've been convicted of cannabis, please reach out to LPP because they can assist in a number of ways for their families as well.
For sure. So if you guys do know anybody, you have a cousin, uncle, auntie, anybody, all you have to do is literally you can Google Last Prisoner Project, go to our website, and there's a very simple intake form that you can fill out with a little bit of your family members' information. That way we can get in touch with whoever it is that's filling out the form, make sure we can do a background check. Our main criteria is that the overlaying charge is cannabis, that they have no other drug charges on the current charge. They can have prior drug charges, that's really none of our business, but the current reason that they're in prison right now is for cannabis. Other criteria is that they have no sexual offenses on their record and they have no violent offenses on their record. Otherwise, they are eligible for our services, which means that they are eligible for commissary payments, legal support, and their children are eligible for grants while they're incarcerated. So please, we are really wanting to help as many people as possible. So if you know anyone here or on the continent, all you have to do is go to our website, fill out the form, and we will walk you and your family member through the process.
Okay, social equity. Okay, we're talking about policies that would help those who have been harmed by the war on drugs, providing them access, opportunities, expungement we talked about, there's licensing and employment preferences, financial assistance, tax revenues helping communities impacted, gender equity issues, business consultation. Representative, you mentioned social equity and the HB measure that's being considered. Want to expand on that, please?
Yes, in House Bill 1246, there's a section for social equity grant program that would, I believe, and this was something that I believe Representative Tarnas has worked on a lot to make sure that there's more entry points into the overall system. I also think that there is other places in the bill that really address sort of like the kinds of discrimination cannabis users face. And so I'm really excited about those. We've had very little work done on the employment side, employment discriminations, housing discriminations, even things like medical care, and making sure that folks who do test positive for cannabis use can have access to different kinds of programs, and especially medical care, organ transplant, not to be disallowed from those kinds of programs. That's found throughout House Bill 1246, and so I think that that's a really important part to be following as well.
Carrie?
The bill, this is a conservative estimate from those who have analyzed, looked at other states, how much income or tax revenue would become through cannabis legalization. They're projecting conservatively about $50 million per year in new tax revenue, and a certain earmarked percentage will go towards public health education grants, which can include substance abuse prevention, treatment, youth programs, after school summer programs. There's also 30% earmarked to go to a social equity fund, which can be used for disadvantaged communities' needs. And there are other provisions as well, but something I just want to throw out there, because just literally earlier this month, there was this discussion about the cost of food for children in our public schools, that they were going to increase the amount for a school lunch double to, I think it was like over $5 or even higher or so. And then there was this, well, we need to do it, especially if the federal government withholds funding, what are we going to do? And we know that there are a number of children who come to school hungry. They just do not have enough food. And one thought possibly, right, in terms of the farming, the produce, you could subsidize, if not all, or maybe partial, so that there's universal free lunch. There are some states that have passed laws to make universal lunch free for keiki, and that could be a possibility.
In terms of social equity, I want to note that it's really sort of built into the bones of the structure in HB 1246 and SB 1613. New licenses will be issued that will include the ability for craft cannabis, which is an emerging market in the adult use landscape. So what you could have is, somebody, growing cannabis for sale direct to consumer. That's not really, it's an emerging development, and it's not really mainstream, but it's very positive that our lawmakers here are looking at the promotion of craft cannabis in Hawaii, particularly on the neighbor islands where people, are away from, the stream of things, and good for them. And this is something that I've been talking about, with some who would like to do that. It also prioritizes legacy growers and small farmers in terms of their licensing as well. We would want to create, we don't want to leave this to the current, cartel of medical cannabis operators, but we also do not want to dither and dilly and dally until something happens on the federal level that allows for interstate commerce, and then we just get flooded with MSO cannabis, So again, we have social equity, not just in terms of the grant program, but in terms of the licensing itself, and that there is a commitment here to bring small producers, rural farmers, into the equation that just really isn't apparent in many other adult use landscapes. And I guess this is the advantage of waiting a little bit, is that we get to see what is working and what's not working and what we want to do intentionally, and instead of just opening the floodgates for big money.
Can I just add something to that? I think our neighbor island legislators have been very key in kind of supporting that piece of the legislation. So if you are a resident of a neighbor island and you know that there are small farmers that could be engaged in this, I think it's really important for folks to reach out to their representatives and their senators and say, hey, this is going to be good for our community. This is going to be good for our coffers. This can be good for jobs. I think there's a real opportunity here for us to kind of broaden the conversation and destigmatize this. Like we know the plant should be destigmatized. We need to involve more people in this industry. So just to that point, again, a shout out to all of our neighbor island representative folks, like our new chair of our agricultural committee, Kristen Aloha, Big Island. But any of our neighbor island legislators, we have our first female speaker who's from Kauai. There's a lot of hemp industry out there as well. And then on that note, really important also, we should be looking at how this is also going to bring in the hemp industry, and I think also open the doors for that part of we don't have enough time for. But again, really important to reach out to your legislators and tell them, look, we want to see this bill move forward because of the opportunities it presents. And then the services it's providing for our community of medical patients who need this product.
Really quickly, I just want to note that if you're from the windward side of Oahu, that there are legislators there who could use a bit of encouragement in terms of embracing cannabis reform. Some of them are fully on board, particularly on the Senate side, but the House side, not so much. So if you live on windward Oahu, Kaneohe, etc., please contact them. And and if also it seems like some folks in our working class communities over in Kalihi, need to contact Ms. Templo and Mr. Hussey in terms of the imperative to that. We had prior good votes that have turned into question marks in those two seats. So if anybody on this is living in Templo's district or Hussey, and wants reform, please contact them and let them know that you're supportive. Mahalo.
Okay, we're going to wrap this up. So what I'd like to do is give each of you 1 to 2 minutes to make a closing statement, or if there's anything that we didn't discuss that you'd like to share. Carrie, would you like to start, or do you want?
Honestly, I feel like I've said so much already. I've given you guys more information about, how you can find out more. If you know anybody that's been impacted by the criminalization of cannabis, just check out our website. Follow us on social media. We definitely share a lot of updates on criminal justice reform as it pertains to cannabis. So at Last Prisoner Project on Instagram is great. And I will pass the mic to you now. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to actually take, Will, your last question, which was, if you were guaranteed 2 cannabis-related bills would be passed this year, what 1 or 2 would you choose? And my answer is going to be a non-answer, which is to say, the turnover at the state legislature has been tremendous. There is an opportunity for the community to educate so many new lawmakers. And I think it's really incumbent, because I don't actually know. It's really kind of going to be a toss-up. And it's because there's I think over 27, they say 27 legislators in the state house that have less than 4 years of experience. So this is really an opportunity. There's a generational change of lawmakers, but it also means that there are folks who need to be educated. And I would just say, you know, approach legislators respectfully, share with them your stories, share with them the positive research you've seen, and then, you know, stay engaged. Because I think this is a topic that's going to require us to be engaged to make sure that we get good policy coming out of this legislature. Thanks.
Thank you.
If I have any message for folks is to be hopeful that we are making progress. Things seems to be slow. Like I said, I've been working on this for over 2 decades now, and I do take some level of satisfaction and gratitude for the progress we have made. But you know, the time is now. Really, you know, a majority of people living in this country live in adult use state. We have just about 3/4 support on a national level for adult use legalization. We have about 60% support here in Hawaii, according to the PRP poll last year. So, you know, we need to take advantage of the opportunity in creating a business culture here that produces well-paying jobs and tax revenues that can benefit our communities across the state in the long term. You know, this tourism can be part of it or not part of it, but what we have here is an opportunity to prepare for forthcoming federal legalization and interstate commerce, and ensuring that Hawaii maintains, you know, a good reputation across the nation and the globe for its agricultural products, including cannabis. So, you know, thank you and for being here today. And I'm preaching to the choir here. Let's make it happen.
For ACLU, we just want to encourage and empower all of you to get engaged in the legislative process. Sometimes we get jaded, we become cynical, and maybe you've been testifying for many years, or you might be a first-time testifier. It can make a difference, and I want to encourage you. Next week, Tuesday, is the first hearing, but even beyond that, we need to get through each committee, like these hoops we jump, and we are making progress, but we need more of you to be physically present to testify, and if you can't be there in person, submit written testimony, or you have the option of testifying virtually. And so I'm going to make a shameless plug. Outside, we have a table for ACLU of Hawaii. We have a number of, I think we have some t-shirts, we have some advocacy materials that debunk a lot of the myths and a lot of the fear tactics that Prosecutor and others are going out door to door to lawmakers. And so we want to counter that with facts, with data, and the personal stories that you can share make a difference. And if you can contact your specific lawmaker, especially if they're on the fence, that might help them to have the courage to vote in favor of it. And last, I want to add, there is no such thing as a perfect bill when you're doing public policy. I can tell you last year, ACLU Hawaii, we're part of a coalition, Hawaii Alliance for Cannabis Reform. Last year, this bill was drafted by the Attorney General, and we just commented because we supported the concept of legalization, but there are too many provisions in the bill that we had concerns about. And so our approach was comment, support legalization, and list literally pages of amendments. But this year, in reviewing the bill very carefully, our position has shifted. We are supporting. Are there areas for improvement? Yes. And I understand for a lot of legacy growers, we want to see more language in there, but this is the opportunity. And for us, sort of our threshold is, if we can stop more people from being arrested, which is the entrance into the criminal legal system, this for us, we're going to take a stand in favor of it, and let's work to improve it. So mahalo.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists, for joining us. Thank you to the Hawaii Cannabis Expo for allowing this format. And again, the takeaway from here is number one, protecting our children and our youth is paramount. And we want to make certain that cannabis is not something that's readily available to them. And we want to make certain that the adults who use it and those who have had negative situations in the past, that future opportunities are available to everyone. And that you don't have to have a lot of money, or you don't have to be well connected, because cannabis will and can provide an opportunity for all Hawaii residents. And it could mean the difference between living in Hawaii or moving to the mainland if the proper opportunities are given to everybody. So with that, I'm hoping that our panelists will be around to informally answer some questions. And thank you everyone for joining us. This will be on YouTube in the future.
Yes.
If anyone wants to watch it again or tell their friends about it. And one closing comment?
Sorry, sir. I just have to, you said something that as a mother, I needed to weigh in again. I am a mother and I have a son who is just turned 13 years old and I'm sorry, I was looking at my text, he's at a chess tournament right now. But as a mother, I've shared with a number of lawmakers who said, aren't you concerned about our keiki our youth? I'm like, I am absolutely concerned about my son, my nieces and nephews. I'm a grandaunt actually as well. And for me, knowing that if there's going to be regulation, testing and taxation, I know we can argue about the taxation, but having some regulation to know that if my son or his friends or others were to experiment, to know what's in the product, to know that maybe there aren't pesticides and other, to me that is as a mother, that makes me feel safer than not having regulation.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience members. Have a great weekend. Thank you.